Welcome to the Macat analysis of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. In his 1807 work, Phenomenology of Spirit, G.W.F. Hegel introduced the world to his philosophical system. His most influential work, and the culmination of the German idealist movement begun in the late 18th century as a response to the works of Immanuel Kant, the book remains one of the undisputed classics of Western thought. Stay tuned to find out more. An analysis of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Ways into the text. Key points. G.W.F. Hegel was a German philosopher who was born in 1770. His text Phenomenology of Spirit was published in 1807. Phenomenology of Spirit explores the nature of human understanding. In it, Hegel was trying to define how we gain knowledge. Hegel not only broke with earlier philosophical traditions, he did so in a work that was very ambitious. Phenomenology tries to outline the whole of human experience. Who was G.W.F. Hegel? G.W.F. Hegel, the author of Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, was born in the German city of Stuttgart on August 27, 1770. At the age of 3, Hegel began his formal education. He studied at a gymnasium, a school with a reputation for being highly academic, from the age of 6. Then at the age of 18, went to the Tübinger Stift, a boarding school attached to the University of Tübingen. Although this school usually trained young men for entry into the church, not all its students ended up following that career. Hegel left Tübingen in 1793 and found work as a tutor for an aristocratic family. He wrote several important essays during this period. In 1801, he moved to a city called Jena in Prussia, a country in what is today northern Germany, where he became a lecturer at the university. By 1805, he had been promoted to the rank of extraordinary professor, but he did not receive a salary, meaning that it became a financial necessity for him to finish Phenomenology of Spirit. In 1806, a battle took place at Jena between the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and the Prussian army. The town was almost destroyed, and many university students fled. Phenomenology was published soon after. By this time, Hegel had a reputation as an important thinker. Phenomenology was the starting point for all his later philosophical texts. It was an important step in the development of a philosophical field known as idealism, the idea that reality is made in the mind. Hegel's ideas were very complex, and there are still arguments as to their true meaning. What does Phenomenology of Spirit say? Phenomenology is about how to approach the question, what really matters? According to Hegel, all reality is constructed by the mind, although crucially the mind itself is not aware of it. Reality for Hegel is a vast, complex system that he called the Absolute. According to idealism, reality is not made up of the things that exist outside our heads. It is actually within the mind. But how can we begin to understand something so complex? Hegel's Absolute changed over time. He argued that only by understanding the Absolute in its entirety could we arrive at truth. Understanding only part of it could logically only be partly true. Yet even partial truths were worth exploring, he believed. Each part must contain a glimmer of truth. By carefully exploring it, we might get closer to an understanding. Imagine that a patient who cannot remember anything he has ever learned has just been given an orange that has been sliced into 16 segments. He has no memory of oranges at all. He is now told to examine the objects one at a time. After examining the first segment, he might conclude that oranges are in fact small wedge-shaped objects. As he explores further, he might then realize his earlier theory was wrong since the objects seem to fit together. The patient now moves through stages of thinking, an orange is wedge-shaped, an orange is a semisphere, and so on. Each step provides more information about what an orange actually is. but the curved shape of the first segment still suggests that the orange might be round, even before it has been fully reassembled. Phenomenology, however, is as much about the methodology of discovery, that is, the way discoveries are made, as it is about coming to conclusions. We can easily imagine the patient working out the nature of an orange by using his senses. But understanding the idea of the absolute is more difficult. Hegel felt we needed a new way of looking at objects. Questions surrounding the nature of objects are part of a branch of philosophy known as ontology that dates back to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Phenomenology examines two important elements of this field: categories and truth. Categories can be thought of as a way of separating objects from one another. Aristotle, for instance, created categories such as substance, quality, and place. Without categories, Hegel argued, we can say nothing about what there is. Hegel's second concept of ontology tells us which things are true or real. For Hegel, not everything was equally real. Chairs and numbers both exist, for example, but one is more real than the other. Ideas like this were dominating German thought at the time. The philosopher Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, had started an explosion of philosophical activity in Germany. Several different views were then developed. The author and philosopher F. H. Jacobi tried to base knowledge on ethics, faith, and feeling. The poet and philosopher Friedrich Schlegel and the writer Novalis emphasized the intrinsic value of nature. The philosophers K. L. Reinhold and Johann Gottlieb Fichte tried to add depth to Kant's theories. Hegel and his friend Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling both put forward a more systematic explanation. Hegel assumed that his readers would have a good understanding of Western philosophy, and especially recent developments in the field. Because of this assumption, however, phenomenology can be difficult for a modern reader. Why does phenomenology of spirit matter? Phenomenology is important because of its position in the history of philosophy. The text is seen as Hegel's masterpiece, and it marks the end of the period of German idealist philosophy that began with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, 1781. This intense period of intellectual thought is almost unique. Only Athens in the 5th century BCE and the European Renaissance, the period following the Middle Ages when European thinkers and artists turned to ancient Greek and Roman models to reinvigorate European culture, can match it. And even within this extraordinary period, phenomenology stands out as one of its most important texts. The text can also be seen as the point at which philosophy's boundaries with other disciplines began to blur. Although sociology, the study of the nature and structure of society, history, economics, and anthropology, the study of human cultures, did not develop until years later, all were influenced by this text. Even on its own, phenomenology is one of the key texts of the 19th century. Many of Hegel's core ideas, such as those on alienation, at its core, the process whereby individuals begin to see the world around them as alien, and recognition, are still debated today. For most of the 20th century, phenomenology was seen from a Marxist viewpoint. That is, it was understood, particularly in the Soviet Union, according to the analysis of society proposed in the work of the economist and social theorist Karl Marx. Paradoxically, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the decline of Marxism appears to have reinvigorated interest in Hegel's idea. He has regained the attention of leading scholars, such as the American social theorist Francis Fukuyama, for example. It is not just the variety of topics in phenomenology that makes it so important. The text succeeds in shaping them into a single philosophical vision. Since Hegel, no scholar has tried to write anything so ambitious as phenomenology. Hegel's account of the history of Western consciousness was a massive task, but it was also only half the picture. He also tried to include an analysis of philosophical and cultural movements and the way they connected to one another. The text explored ideas that were quite different from earlier philosophy. Unlike much of Hegel's work, these ideas, in their raw form, are easy to understand. Hegel's argument was that philosophical truths emerged as history progressed, that the two developed side by side. Hegel's ideas had a profound impact on the course of history. Understanding the importance of such historicism, the role of history on society, can do much to help students of any field understand historical events after 1806. End of the Ways In module. Coming up next, Section 1, Influences. Module 1, The Author and the Historical Context. Section 1, Influences. Module 1, The Author and the Historical Context. Key points. Hegel's Phenomenology is a work of great importance that has influenced philosophy ever since it was published. Hegel's friendship with the philosopher Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, whom he met as a student, was important to his later role as lecturer at Jena University. Hegel wrote Phenomenology during the Napoleonic Wars, the conflicts provoked by the military actions of the French Emperor Napoleon, in a period when the ideas of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant were being revisited. Why read this text? G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, German title Phenomenologie des Geistes, is a unique work in Western philosophy in terms of its style, aims, and scope. Although it has been in and out of fashion since its publication in 1807, it is still one of the most influential works of the past 2 centuries. It consists of a long preface, a short methodological introduction, that is, an introduction in which Hegel lays out the philosophical approach he will be using, and then 8 chapters that chart the development of what Hegel calls consciousness. It should be noted that Hegel's view of consciousness differs from what is commonly understood by the word. The philosopher Immanuel Kant believed that there was a bridge between mind and matter. He argued that as you observe something through your senses, it is understood or interpreted through concepts. In this way, someone suffering from amnesia, with no memory of ever having seen an orange, would not be so confused as you might expect when finally seeing one for the first time. Hegel, too, saw these concepts as rules that allow us to work out the properties of an object we see. The most general of these concepts form part of the categories Hegel identified. Hegel also argued that the individual consciousness tries to find self-knowledge through meeting other individual consciousnesses, so a collective consciousness builds up over time, an idea that is not as difficult to understand as it might seem. For example, a man who has lived his whole life in a desert can still understand what snow is by having it explained using concepts he is familiar with, such as white and cold. This idea of a collective consciousness is crucial to understanding Hegel. In fact, he developed it further by examining the collective consciousnesses of societies that he thought were crucial to the development of Western consciousness as a whole. These ideas had an enormous impact on the political evolution of the 19th and 20th centuries. It is perhaps because of the book's ambition and the variety of its themes that there are still arguments about the text. Scholars such as the British professor of philosophy, Stephen Houlgate, have pointed out that the text is best understood as an introduction to Hegel's larger philosophical system. Others, such as the French philosopher Jean Hippolyte, believe that Phenomenology was a kind of Bildungsroman, philosophical novel, telling the tale of the coming of age, education, and philosophical growth of a character called consciousness. This has led to the idea that Hegel was examining a process as it was actually unfolding. Author's life. Hegel was born in the city of Stuttgart, now in Germany, but at that time in the Duchy of Württemberg, part of a number of affiliated Central European territories known as the Holy Roman Empire. Although Hegel's family was reasonably well off, several tragedies marked his early life. His mother died in September 1781 when he was 11, and the same fever that killed her almost took his life too. He began his formal education at the age of 3 and proceeded to receive an excellent level of education. At the age of 18, he enrolled at a Protestant seminary in Tübingen, Protestantism being one of the 2 largest branches of Christianity. Although seminaries were schools for those intending to become priests, not all students who studied there ended up serving the church. Hegel and his friend, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, for example, became philosophers. Hegel began writing Phenomenology in 1805 at the University of Vienna, where he had been an unpaid professor since 1801. The university was a famous philosophical center of excellence due to the work of both resident professor Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Schelling. It was no coincidence that Hegel ended up in Jena. His connection to Schelling was key to his successful application to the institution. Author's background. Phenomenology was completed during the chaos of Napoleon Bonaparte's victory over the Prussian army at the Battle of Jena on October 14, 1806. Jena was a city in the state of Prussia, in what is today northern Germany. Having defeated Prussia, Napoleon began to demolish the Holy Roman Empire, the political landscape within which Hegel lived and worked. Fortunately, Hegel sent most of the manuscript to his publisher before he fled Jena, with the final pages of Phenomenology, thereby ensuring its publication. Hegel's unique perspective on these important international events added an extra element to an already groundbreaking work. But it was not just the shifting political landscape that was important. This was also an extremely fertile intellectual period. The form and style of Phenomenology are strikingly original, but many of its central ideas were dominating German intellectual life at the time. The years following the publication of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1781 saw an explosion of philosophical activity in Germany. Among the positions that developed at this time were the novelist and philosopher F. H. Jacobi's attempts to base knowledge on ethics, concepts of right and wrong, faith and feeling. The German Romanticism, a movement in the arts that emphasized the importance of emotion as an aesthetic experience, of figures such as Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis, and the systematic adaptations of Kantianism, the philosophy of Kant, proposed by the philosophers K. L. Reinhold and Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Fichte's connection to the university where both Hegel and Schelling worked influenced the 2 men to follow his approach. End of Section 1, Module 1. Coming up next, Section 1, Influences, Module 2, Academic Context. Section 1, Influences, Module 2, Academic Context. Key points. G.W.F. Hegel was interested in whether or not the modern age had a distinctive character. Many German intellectuals were interested in classical Greek thought, especially that related to nature and values. Hegel was at the center of this intellectual world. The work in its context. To G.W.F. Hegel, the term phenomenology had a very specific, complex meaning. Hegel was referring to what he described as a scientific treatment of the experience of an idealized consciousness. We can think of this aspect of the work, perhaps, as a very sophisticated and rigorous thought experiment. As we have seen, Hegel's definition of consciousness is quite particular, but so is his use of the term scientific. It is important to note that the German word for science, Wissenschaft, is used for any systematic form of inquiry, not just the natural sciences. So we should view Hegel's approach not as scientific, but as systematic, a process with a beginning, middle, and end. Although Hegel expected his readers to understand this looser sense of the term, his move from normal modes of thought is still significant. Indeed, his idea to create a science out of consciousness's experience and his method for explaining its development were both highly original. Hegel was a part of a larger community of German intellectuals who were all investigating various aspects of the modern world in which they lived. This diverse group had two things in common, aside from shared language and culture. First, they had an almost obsessive interest in classical Greek culture, inspired by the art historian Joachim Winckelmann's The History of Ancient Art, 1764. German academics, from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Johann Gottfried Herder to Friedrich Schiller, and even Hegel's contemporary Friedrich Schlegel, had been inspired by the idea that Greek art was the finest the world had ever seen. Nostalgia for the world of the Greek city-state, the polis, was widespread. So was the belief that the modern world could never achieve either the same levels of beauty in art or virtue in political character as the Greeks. Hegel, however, differed. While he shared their popular love of Greece, he set out to combat nostalgia. The second uniting principle was that the work of these intellectuals can be viewed either as a critical response to or development of Kant's so-called critical philosophy, a dominant idea of the 1780s and early 1790s. Overview of the field. Phenomenology of spirit deals with issues that were central to the intellectual life of the period. Hegel was working in a complicated field known as idealism that had many subdivisions. One of the subdivisions was in direct opposition to materialism. Immanuel Kant's view, known as transcendental idealism, states that the mind shapes the world around us into what we perceive as reality. Whether reality is ultimately just in the mind was not something Kant committed to. Hegel's view, known as absolute idealism, differs from transcendental idealism in a number of ways. Hegel insists that reality can only be understood as a whole, and introduces the idea of a collective consciousness. This argues against the idea that those around an individual tend to influence his or her views. Hegel also created the concept of a developmental history, according to which societies examine ways of thinking, reject them, and replace them with something more refined. Since these philosophical ideas had to do with the creation of political systems, they had a real-world relevance. The political climate was volatile, and German thinkers were now forced to take a stand on the question of political authority. When Hegel wrote Phenomenology, he was aware of the need to have an independent voice in a world that was becoming dominated by ideologies. He had been viewed as a supporter of his colleague, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling's so-called identity philosophy, a philosophical approach concerned with things such as the permanence of personal identity. But Phenomenology showed that Hegel had a legitimate voice of his own. His departure from the Kantian school was a major development in the history of philosophy, and an opportunity for academic philosophy to engage with the political world. Academic influences. Hegel was clearly influenced by the work of Kant, whose ideas about a universal invisible church, invisible because it was internal and founded on pure reason, are easy to see in Phenomenology. It was a concept with practical and political implications. The invisible church provided philosophical reasons to oppose orthodoxy, hierarchy, and the patrician politics, ruled by a group of families, of the Holy Roman Empire, a group of territories in Central Europe. Hegel believed that modernity, the modern era, often assumed to have begun in the late 15th century, was essentially different from the ancient world. Modernity possessed distinct values based upon individual freedom, and modern citizens needed to appreciate the nature of these values and the reasons for their existence. Although Hegel found Kant's emphasis on individual autonomy, the power to make one's own decisions, an inspiring challenge to traditional authority, Hegel's ideas of collective consciousness somewhat diluted the power of that autonomy. Similarly, Hegel found Kant's supposed demolition of natural theology, roughly the attempt to find religious truths from the observation of the natural world, highly inspiring. The traditional rationalist philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, rationalism being a branch of philosophy founded on the idea that knowledge comes from reason, called Kant the all-destroyer, and the young minds that followed Kant were eager to build on the foundations he had torn down. Indeed, by arguing that there was no rational proof or belief in God and the soul, Kant's work challenged the whole of traditional theology in fundamental ways. Hegel, we know, came to the conclusion that the absolute was, in the end, something that could be understood. During his time studying in Tübingen, he had violently disagreed with his teacher, the theologian Gottlob Stoll, over Kant's idea that God and the soul were postulates of pure practical reason. A postulate is a theoretical proposition intended to test an idea, so by this, Kant had meant that such things were noumenal, a word he used to describe unknown things, such as the afterlife, and therefore neither provable nor disprovable. End of Section 1. Module 2. Coming up next, Section 1. Influences. Module 3. The problem. Section 1. Influences. Module 3. The problem. Key points. In the wake of Immanuel Kant's theories, many thinkers moved into the field of ontology, the study of the nature of being. Although Kant's ideas dominated thought in Germany, they were so complex that many different conclusions were reached. Hegel also adapted Kant, but did so in a unique way. Phenomenology might have had no predecessors, but because of its complexity, it had no successors either. Core question. The core question of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is, what really matters? While the language used to discuss the absolute, for Hegel, an unchanging, independent, and ultimately unknowable truth, may be unfamiliar. Hegel's interest in how objects are, in fact, belongs to the field of ontology, a field of inquiry that deals with the doctrine of being. He split his analysis into two parts that he named conceptions. The first conception tried to clarify the general concepts or categories that can be used to decide what exists. The Greek philosopher Aristotle believed that there were 10 categories. Everything that existed fitted into one of them. For example, you might encounter an object and declare that it fitted into the category substance. For Kant, this was simply a matter of judgment. For Hegel, however, analyzing these categories was essential. It is possible to think about the categories using simpler terms than those that Hegel or Kant provided. How can one understand a hot cup of tea? The categories of hot, wet, and drink tell us something. But these categories themselves also fit into more general categories. Drink, for example, fits into the category liquid. The second conception tells us which things have the status of being truly real. This is asking a very simple question. Is everything about which we can have precise thoughts using categories equally real? This returns us to the earlier question. Is a chair more real than an abstract concept such as a number? Hegel's phenomenology tackled this in a very specific and original way. The first concept of ontology clarified the question of how things are, while the second clarified the question of what there is. The participants. In many respects, G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is unique. In terms of its central claims, method, and style, and the combining of its wide and distinctive range of topics, it has no real predecessors or successors. This does not mean, however, that later philosophers did not try to develop its ideas, or that its themes did not attract interest at the time. For example, Hegel's famous discussion in Phenomenology of the master-slave dialectic, a struggle between two consciousnesses, one seeking to be recognized as superior, the other not giving that recognition, had implications for a wide range of philosophical topics. Although mainly a contribution to modern theories of natural rights, rights possessed by all, regardless of social or moral codes, his theory would have been seen by readers in relation to the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte's analysis of the same issue of master and slave. Indeed, it was Fichte who introduced the idea of mutual recognition, the part of us that wants to be recognized as a human being, to describe the basic freedoms to which rational beings are entitled, and provide a justification for those freedoms. The English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes had argued that beings with their own motivations and desires end up in conflict with each other and must make a social contract to have long-term relations. The political philosopher John Locke, meanwhile, followed by looking at the nature of the individual self-consciousness to find rules of social behavior approved by God. He concluded that personal identity is a matter of psychological continuity. The French philosopher René Descartes came to a different conclusion, saying, "Man innately knows basic logical propositions." All of these questions basically asked, what makes me the person that I am? For Descartes, the answer was the soul. But for Locke, the answer was more complex. He argued that an empty mind was shaped by experiences that came from sensations and reflections. Locke's views on consciousness predated Kant. Fichte, however, was able to draw on Kantian arguments that explain the conditions of self-consciousness that Descartes and Locke took for granted. He identified those conditions with a kind of conflict theorized by Hobbes. In other words, the existence of human conflict is due to our sense of self. But although this manages to describe the origin of conflict, it does not explain conflict's basic nature. This can be thought of as the grudge that our sense of identity has with the rest of the world. For Fichte, the answer had to do with recognition. We reach the status of rational, rights-bearing free beings when one consciousness recognizes another consciousness. The contemporary debate. Phenomenology is often seen as the key text in which Hegel explores the idea that philosophical truth is basically developmental, and that it emerges as history progresses. This is an idea that differs from previous philosophy, but Hegel was working in a philosophical tradition. The influence of Immanuel Kant is clear in Hegel's attempt to take Kant's ideas on transcendental idealism one step further. Hegel's influences stretch back as far as the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, and included both René Descartes and the Dutch thinker Benedictus de Spinoza. The debate at the time, however, was dominated by those thinkers who were also trying to modify or complete the works of Kant. The main reason for this interest in the absolute was Kant's discussion of the unconditioned in the section of his Critique of Pure Reason entitled The Transcendental Dialectic. There, Kant discussed absolute objects, objects that establish our empirical knowledge, that is, our knowledge drawn from experience, and that do not themselves require grounding. Indeed, the term absolute was common in post-Kantian idealist philosophy. Fichte placed the absolute I, or ego, at the center of his philosophy. Schelling's philosophy of the absolute was itself an attempt to combine Fichte's absolute I with Spinoza's pantheistic, the belief that God and nature are one, and supposedly absolute view of nature. End of Section 1, Module 3. Coming up next, Section 1, Influences. Module 4, The Author's Contribution. Section 1, Influences. Module 4, The Author's Contribution. Key points. Hegel's aim in writing Phenomenology of Spirit was to provide an introduction to what he called philosophical science. Hegel's primary contribution was to invent his own method for arriving at conclusions. He called this his science of logic. Hegel tackled ideas that were common in the post-Kantian world, such as the problem of working out what was real and the nature of mutual recognition. Author's aims. G.W.F. Hegel's principal aim in Phenomenology of Spirit was to discover what really matters. He wanted to create a new way of tackling some of the concepts that had been introduced by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. He argued that his science of logic was necessary if we were to have any hope of understanding the absolute. By examining the text's influence on a case-by-case basis, Hegel's aims will be clear. For example, Hegel's contribution to the master-slave dialectic led him to disagree with Johann Gottlieb Fichte's notion that mutual recognition simply dawned on beings as a rational fact. Hegel argued instead that the idea of recognition developed logically during conflict. Hegel supported his colleague Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling's idea that we could understand the absolute by using Kant's concept of intellectual intuition. But he distanced himself from the idea that the absolute had no structure, and that our understanding of it began immediately. Hegel wanted to show that intuition and the gradual unfolding of a structure were one and the same. For Hegel, the conflict itself was less important than the process, because it could be understood as a logical step in the development of an identity. Since Hegel had emphasized the importance of collective consciousness, roughly an idea based on our shared desire for self-knowledge, it followed that human history, too, was a process dominated by the master-slave dialectic. Hegel's purpose was ambitious. He wanted to unravel the entire developmental history of Western civilization. Approach. From what Hegel termed philosophical science came the system of categories that make up the absolute. We should remember that Hegel's absolute consists of what truly or ultimately exists, and that it is contained within the mind. Phenomenology, as an introduction to that science, both surveys and evaluates a series of ontological theories, that is, theories concerned with an inquiry into the nature of being. But its real importance lies in its novel attempt to answer another traditional philosophical question, one that goes back to the 17th century and the French philosopher René Descartes. We can think of this as the question, is ontology even possible? Or rather, is it even possible to know what is real? Hegel's approach was novel because he addressed such doubts in a systematic way that he saw as a scientific exercise. Phenomenology, he noted, is a self-completing skepticism. Hegel was willing to challenge every possible skeptical doubt about how our minds might relate to what there is in truth, until there was nowhere left for the skeptic to go. At this point, he believed we would end up not with empty skeptical doubt, but with real content. This content would be nothing other than knowledge of the absolute, of what is real. It may seem strange that a book that covers themes as diverse as the Roman conception of a person and 18th century pseudoscience addresses only one central question. Yet Hegel is clear that his main subject is whether and how we can know the absolute, how objects are in their actuality or in truth. Contribution and context. Hegel's desire in Phenomenology of Spirit to base philosophy on the absolute would not have surprised his contemporaries, since the term was common in post-Kantian idealist philosophy, idealism being an approach founded on the idea that reality is constructed in the mind. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, for example, placed the absolute I, or ego, at the center of his philosophy. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling's philosophy of the absolute was itself an attempt to combine Fichte's absolute I with the Dutch philosopher Benedictus de Spinoza's pantheistic and supposedly absolute view of nature. The main inspiration for the contemporary mania for the absolute was, of course, not Hegel, but the passage of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, titled Transcendental Dialectic. However, since we can see Hegel's arguments as they developed in texts written when he was in Jena, we can trace his original contribution to the field. Surviving notes from his lectures, letters to friends, drafts of his early logic, and his groundbreaking piece, Philosophy of Spirit of 1804-5, provide direct evidence that Hegel had been developing techniques that he would later employ in phenomenology. Such drafts and sketches have given rise to a scholarly debate about a so-called Ur-phenomenology, an earlier version of the book. Did Hegel originally intend to write a non-historical psychological proof or deduction of his version of the absolute, adding in historical sections later? Among those scholars who think there was an phenomenology, there is also a dispute over which sections of the finished work correspond to it. Whatever position one takes on this, the main philosophical issue is whether Hegel's historical and non-historical forms of argument stand in tension. The debate continues today. Throughout his time in Jena, Hegel's study of thought and meaning, and indeed of philosophy's place within a historical setting, ultimately fed into phenomenology. As a result, phenomenology represents the point at which the epistemology, the study of knowledge, and metaphysics, the branch of philosophy that examines the nature of reality of German idealism, and many argue of Western philosophy itself, takes a fundamental turn toward the acknowledgement of history. End of Section 1, Module 4. Coming up next, Section 2, Ideas. Module 5, Main Ideas. Section 2, Ideas. Module 5, Main Ideas. Key points. Hegel wished to create a scientific method for establishing truth. He identified self-consciousness with a struggle for recognition and pinpointed this struggle as part of an engine that drives history. Hegel wished to show that self-consciousness is essential to any understanding of an object. These main ideas are presented in the preface to the book. They are cryptic and hard to understand. Key themes. The key themes of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit are first, the nature and limits of human knowledge, and second, his belief that the influential philosopher Immanuel Kant's work on idealism, an approach to philosophy founded on the idea that we construct reality in our minds, has not provided the necessary tools Kant needed to achieve his objective. His subject was the entire developmental history of Western civilization, including its history, culture, morality, religion, perception, consciousness, and knowledge. In order to understand this, Hegel's main theme needs to be separated into 4 categories. Thought and meaning depend on the community. Access to objects as they are in truth is always mediated by concepts. Thought and being are identical. History is the progressive education of human beings toward freedom. Hegel was aware that his project would require a thorough understanding of the nature of the absolute, and crucially, how his view of it differed from other philosophers. He therefore begins by showing how an individual consciousness's relation to an object requires increasingly complex conceptual frameworks until it understands that self-consciousness is essential to its knowledge. What is more, he shows that our struggle for mutual recognition is not just basic to human knowledge. It also drives the process of re-evaluating the conceptual framework in the first place. Exploring the ideas. It is possible to gain a sound understanding of phenomenology by bearing in mind the text's 4 central ideas. 1. Thought and meaning are essentially dependent upon the community. 2. Thought's access to objects as they are in truth is always mediated by concepts. 3. Thought and being are identical. 4. History is the progressive education of human beings toward freedom. Our reason is not given to us as a rule book that tells us how we should interact with the world. Hegel argues that it does not come from intuition or a process of reasonable contemplation, ratiocination. Instead, it is created by the internal history of our attempts over time to make sense of the world. As an example, consider a baby attempting to understand what an orange is. Putting it in its mouth, the baby discovers first that the orange is too big, and second that it is not very tasty. The fact that the flesh of the orange actually is tasty is knowledge that is not available to the baby. This orange represents one of Hegel's things with many properties, and so needs to be understood by way of his two conceptions. This requires the education of consciousness, a process of overcoming errors, without which progress cannot be made. Here we again encounter the master-slave dialectic, along with Hegel's insistence that self-consciousness exists in and for itself, when and by the fact that it so exists for another. Self-consciousness is created by an encounter between two beings, who only realize they are self-conscious because of the encounter itself. A fight to the death will lead to what Hegel described as an abstract negation. Failure of the process. The victor claims lordship over the defeated, who, being dead, cannot recognize the master. Only if one of the two is unafraid of death can he achieve mastery. The slave now has to make things for his master. In the end, he begins to see himself in those products and achieves an independent self-consciousness. The master, who now depends on the things the slave has made, has become as much a slave as the slave himself. Progress is only achieved when the master-slave relationship has been reduced. This can be understood in a simple way by looking at history as a process of stages. Greece, as a slave state, gave way to the less restrictive system of serfdom. This was, in turn, replaced by the citizenship of liberal democracies, in which individual freedom was protected. In each case, more freedom is allotted to the slave, and the master becomes less reliant on the slave's products. Language and expression. Hegel knew his philosophical language was challenging, full of technical and unfamiliar vocabulary, but he felt that it was needed. He believed that concepts changed their meaning in different environments. Phenomenology drives home this lesson, repeating the same terms throughout the work, yet subtly shifting their meanings as they appear in different contexts. While the work may appear to be an awkward attempt to glue together psychology and epistemology, the study of knowledge, on the one hand, and history and epistemology on the other, both these aspects combine to produce an all-encompassing vision. The key to understanding this is to recognize how the idea of holism, the conception that all parts of a system must be understood as a whole, unites Hegel's key ideas about grasping both the structure of reality and the structure of social units. The absolute can be understood only by seeing how individual concepts produce further concepts, and how they gain their meaning through their relation to those new concepts. This should be seen as a process, but not a method. It can be revealed only in practice as it is applied to any given situation. This is the essence of dialectical thinking. When Hegel introduces the ideas of negation and mediation, he is referring to concepts producing new concepts. These two new terms refer to the complex process required to create the new concept, the negation, and its relationship to the old concept, the mediation. This is a three-stage process that was later described as a triadic structure of thesis, a thought that has proved to be unsatisfactory. Antithesis, an idea that confirms our suspicion about the flaws in the thesis, but which is itself flawed. And finally, synthesis, a new thought, which will itself be challenged. In this structure, an unstable concept first gives way to another concept. The notion that an individual can only enter into successful relations with another if the second person, too, stands in negative and mediated relations also forms the basis of Hegel's theories of mutual recognition. Many of the topics of phenomenology are about elaborating the holistic structure shared between individuals who recognize each other and the reality of which they are a part. End of Section 2, Module 5. Coming up next, Section 2, Ideas, Module 6, Secondary Ideas. Section 2, Ideas, Module 6, Secondary Ideas. Key points. Hegel's views on mutual recognition came from his analysis of the master-slave dialectic. His views on holism, the idea that parts of a system must be understood in terms of their relation to the whole, gave way to concepts of a divine human identity, in which our consciousness and God were merged into a single thing. Hegel's theories on mutual recognition altered the course of human history. The idea of a divine human identity took theology in new directions and placed value on the importance of humanity in the concept of God. The influence of the idea of mutual recognition cannot be understated. Although students require a good understanding of history to appreciate its impact fully, major events such as the Russian Revolution of 1917 and even entire periods such as the Cold War can be traced back to Hegel's thinking. Other ideas. The secondary themes of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit include his ideas of holism and dialectical thinking. Hegel's theory of holism, although deeply controversial, says that concepts can only be understood in terms of their relation to the whole. In short, to understand what really matters, the whole must be understood first. In Phenomenology, such ideas are most apparent in parts of the text that examine theology, the systematic study of Scripture. This can be seen in the religion section and its transition into absolute knowledge. From there, the ideas of divine human identity are most accessible. Having understood that every stage of any given process is partial and potentially untrue, it becomes clear that a new way of thinking is needed, the dialectic. For Hegel, totality contains within itself the partial truths of prior stages that it has overcome. Dialectical thought, then, is a process. It is more than a means simply to come to a conclusion. The importance of dialectics cannot be understated, especially its impact on history. The political theorist Karl Marx, for example, was deeply influenced by Hegel's ideas and eventually added the idea of mutual recognition to his wider theories on class struggle, which he theorized would end when working people organized themselves to end their exploitation at the hands of the ruling and the business classes. This had a deep impact on the course of history. The influence of Hegel's idea of alienation, that is, the result of failures in mutual recognition, was not limited to its obvious connection to Marxism-Leninism, the founding ideology of the Soviet Union. Instead, it is important to realize that it has affected a wide range of academic fields and social and political movements for more than 150 years. Exploring the ideas. Dialectical thinking can be explained in terms of an automobile engine that has been spread out in parts across the ground. To understand the engine properly, one must assemble it. Each piece, when placed in the right order, gives us a partial truth about the nature of the engine and its function. Even placing it in the wrong order reveals some truth, because knowledge of its incorrect position is still useful. Once fully constructed, the engine has achieved totality, and yet it still contains all of the earlier partial truths. Critically, nothing has been lost. Hegel likened this to a spiral. Think of a wheel with a mark on it where it touches the ground. When the wheel is rolled 360 degrees, it is clear that although the mark is still touching the ground, it has moved from its original position. This process is complete within separate categories, which for Hegel were being, becoming, one, many, essence, existence, cause, effect, universal, mechanism, and life. As each process is examined and revealed to be only a partial truth, it in turn creates another category that shows more promise. This rejection of one category toward another more refined category is known as negation. The idea can easily be applied to mutual recognition. The state of mutual recognition, Hegel suggests, does not occur spontaneously between human beings. Instead, individuals must overcome social relations in which they do not recognize one another as equal authorities on truth and ethics. True self-knowledge, social stability, and a legitimate political order depend upon mutual recognition. But they result from a process in which recognition is not matched. At first, the process of recognition, will exhibit the side of the inequality of the two, or the splitting up of the middle term into the extremes, which, as extremes, are opposed to one another, one being only recognized, the other only recognizing. Mutual recognition in this sense is just the accepting and respecting of another being. Such recognition remains fundamental to human psychology. The desire for recognition is the desire for equality, as relevant to class struggle as it is to feminism, the struggle against racial inequality, or apartheid, or any other inequality. Throughout Phenomenology, Hegel shows different examples of the psychological and social harm he sees resulting from failures of recognition in different cultures and political systems. This is the harm he calls alienation. Meanwhile, the idea of a divine human identity saw Hegel drawing on incarnation theology, the study of the incarnation, the virgin birth, and human life of Christ, and Benedictus de Spinoza's pantheistic vision, his equation of God and nature. Hegel certainly identified his idea of the absolute with God. As we have seen, Hegel's absolute is neither a static thing nor a theoretical idea. It is instead the process of developing a system for understanding reality over historical time. Hegel's theory of divine human identity, therefore, does not say that any given human or group is divine. He says we will find the divine in the human attempt to bring to consciousness a rational structure that includes the mind and the world. Overlooked. Since its publication, very little of Phenomenology has escaped analysis. This is particularly evident in the 1997 commentary on Phenomenology, written by the British philosopher-scholar H.S. Harris, whose list of studies specifically related to Hegel's philosophy runs to 70 pages. Ideas in the text have been applied to new problems that have arisen outside the area of philosophy. For example, the Hegel commentator and philosopher Michael Quandt has shown interest in the chapter subsection dealing with logical and psychological laws and with phrenology, the science of analyzing a person's character and potential from the bumps on their head, and physiognomy, the science of reading a person's character from their face. At first sight, it seems surprising that Hegel's mocking treatment of phrenology and physiognomy should receive such attention now. But Hegel was arguing against understanding logical phenomena in terms of their physical states. Philosophers such as Quandt find his arguments useful in critiquing reductionist programs, that is, analytical methods based on a reductive oversimplification. They also provide useful clues for philosophers working in modern action theory, which discusses the causes and significance of human actions. An examination of the historical reconstruction and dialectical development of phenomenology might also assist in other problematic areas of political and moral philosophy. Much contemporary discussion about ethical and political value consists in battles between realist philosophers who say that values are objective, absolute, and eternal, and others who take values to be subjective, relative, and transitory. This battle goes back to the ancient Greek philosopher Plato's influential Republic, in which we read of the philosopher Socrates arguing with a public intellectual called Thrasymachus. Hegel's phenomenological method represents an attempt to acknowledge that values change within social and historical contexts without succumbing to relativism, the idea that points of view have no absolute truth. End of Section 2, Module 6. Coming up next, Section 2, Ideas, Module 7, Author's Achievement. Section 2, Ideas, Module 7, Author's Achievement. Key points. Hegel wanted to write an introduction to what he called philosophical science, namely his own system, and especially to his science of logic. Hegel set out his ideas in a logical, methodical way, but claimed that they could not be understood until the whole thing had been digested. Hegel's ideas were so complicated that they were open to interpretation. Two camps, dubbed left and right, soon sprung up with radically different emphases and interpretations. Assessing the argument. G.W.F. Hegel intended his Phenomenology of Spirit to serve as an introduction to a system of his own, called philosophical science, and especially to his science of logic. As such, phenomenology has at least two main aims. The first is to bring the reader to see the necessity of philosophical science. Hegel wanted to show that neither everyday consciousness nor the philosophical tradition was capable of properly understanding the relationship between the mind and the world. Hegel called this the standpoint of the consciousness. The second aim was to bring the reader to what he called the standpoint of science. Here, understanding will then be replaced by reason, and the rational structure of actuality, of what exists in truth, can be revealed. This process of revealing the rational form of actuality, of what Hegel calls the absolute, or the idea, is the aim of Hegel's science of logic. It is not the aim of phenomenology. Nevertheless, by attaining the standpoint of science, the reader can be assured that the world is fundamentally rational. In this sense, we can see that Hegel's achievement within phenomenology is necessarily limited. The text is, in effect, an introduction to a wider philosophical debate. Phenomenology, therefore, is a tool set designed to equip its reader with the necessary skills to follow Hegel into later works. Nevertheless, as the text unfolds, Hegel's attempt to construct a philosophical science reveals insights, among them the master-slave dialectic, which were to have a profound effect on both academic thought and real-world politics. Hegel fulfilled his belief that philosophical science is not only necessary, but also capable of having a real impact on the world. Achievement in context. The historical context within which Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit was written is critical to its understanding, although perhaps not in obvious ways. The sheer complexity of the text made it inaccessible to most contemporary readers. Time was needed not only to digest its content, but also to allow its ideas to filter into wider circles. Divisions over its importance characterized the battles between right and left, or young Hegelians, in the decades after his death in 1831. Right Hegelians saw Hegel's later works as providing an intellectual justification for the status quo, the contemporary political and religious order. Left Hegelians, on the other hand, embrace phenomenology for its stress on historical change and its critical potential. As a young man, the philosopher Karl Marx was deeply influenced by Hegel's dialectical method and his emphasis on the role of labor in the development of consciousness. Marxist thought in the 20th century has frequently engaged with Hegel, especially since the 1960s, when the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser identified a Hegelian and humanist early Marx. In this sense, we can see the importance of the context within which phenomenology was written. It helped to describe modernity as it was seen from the perspective of 1807. In this period of political upheaval, Hegel saw the potential for an endpoint to historical change. It was this very upheaval that made the text so compelling. After 1815, many of the so-called gains of the French Revolution, the period between 1789 and 1799, in which France's monarchy was overthrown and a republic declared, with political and social repercussions throughout Europe, were reversed, and the map of Europe was largely returned to its pre-revolutionary borders. Such reversals of the direction of history only added fuel to the debate. Limitations. Hegel's thought was certainly not limited to the period in which he was writing. The spirit of revolution that had found expression in both the American Revolutionary War, in which the young United States fought against the forces of the British Empire for their independence, and the French Revolution, had certainly revealed aspects of modernity that were unique to their times. Few individual works of philosophy have been so fertile or liable to swing in and out of fashion as Phenomenology of Spirit. While it is still relevant more than 200 years after its publication, the nature of that relevance has varied according to the time and location of its supporters. much so-called continental philosophy, a set of 19th and 20th century philosophies from mainland Europe, especially from World War II onward, has been virtually impossible to understand without Hegel. One central reason for this is that a number of leading French intellectuals attended the philosopher Alexandre Kojeve's lectures on phenomenology in the 1930s. Kojeve's distinctive reading of the text drew heavily on Karl Marx and the German philosopher Martin Heidegger's Phenomenology, in the sense of an inquiry into the nature of consciousness. This should not be confused with phenomenology as Hegel used the term. Hegel, for example, emphasized the master-slave dialectic and the themes of psychological integrity and the self's quest for completion. Among the attendees were the sociologist Raymond Aron, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Sartre's masterpiece, Being and Nothingness, is filled with Hegelian terms and ideas, such as the relation between being for self and being for others, in his analysis of the phenomenology of human relations. Lacan, who was also deeply affected by the philosopher Jean Hippolyte's commentary on phenomenology, took ideas from Hippolyte when he came to propose his own theory of the development of the psyche. Politically speaking, it was Marx, and not Hegel, who dominated 20th century history. But the collapse of the Soviet Union and its obvious failings in the period following World War II caused some, notably the political theorist Francis Fukuyama, to reassess Kojeve's interpretation of Hegel and reapply it to the late 20th century. End of Section 2, Module 7. Coming up next, Section 2, Ideas, Module 8, Place in the Author's Work. Section 2, Ideas, Module 8, Place in the Author's Work. Key points. Hegel was attempting to create a scientific method of differentiating between what we perceive as reality and what is actually real. Opinion is divided on whether or not phenomenology represents an introduction to Hegel's ideas or can be viewed as a standalone text. Phenomenology is Hegel's best-known work. It certainly marked him as an important philosopher. Positioning. In terms of its content, G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology is, in many ways, the work of a mature scholar. His philosophy of the absolute was a continuation of prior thought that philosophers such as his former roommate, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, had also tackled. Hegel's departure from Schelling can be traced to two of Hegel's earlier works. The difference between Fichte's and Schelling's systems of philosophy, 1801, and Faith and Knowledge, 1802. It was, however, in phenomenology that these differences were made clear and examined at length. Hegel argued that the absolute was not a static being or principle, but was rather a process. His absolute cannot be understood as an immediate, simple object of thought. Instead, it is a process of change and development, driven by the internal principle he called negation. Nevertheless, there are fundamental differences between the philosophy he developed during his time in the city of Jena, including phenomenology, and his mature system. His Jena philosophy emphasized the role played by human social activity in creating ways of being intelligible. But his mature system saw individual subjects swallowed up by a grand logical system in which they are just appearances. The German scholar Hans Friedrich Fulda, among others, has pointed out that Hegel's encyclopedia contains a section entitled Phenomenology of Spirit, which revises the ideas of the first 4 chapters of the 1807 Phenomenology, suggesting that Hegel had abandoned the early work. Not everyone agreed with this interpretation, however. Scholars such as the American academic Michael N. Forster argue that Hegel always saw phenomenology as the introduction to his system. Integration. Hegel's major works after phenomenology clearly form part of what is intended to be a complete, self-contained philosophical system. This system is laid out in the 3 parts of Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, 1817, 2nd edition, 1827, 3rd edition, 1830, comprising a logic, a philosophy of nature, and a philosophy of mind. Hegel also published a larger version of his Science of Logic, first part 1812, second part 1813, third part 1816, which is the foundation of the system, and a political philosophy, Elements of the Philosophy of Right, 1821, which is meant as an elaboration of the objective spirit section of the encyclopedia. Debate continues today as to whether the philosophy of phenomenology is compatible with the mature system, and if it is, what relation they are meant to have with each other. Political events clearly had an effect on Hegel's thought process. For example, phenomenology was completed just as Napoleon Bonaparte defeated the Prussian army at the Battle of Jena. Centuries of tradition were swept aside, and the political landscape of Europe seemed to have been changed forever. Napoleon's eventual defeat in 1815 enabled the victorious nations to return much of Europe to its pre-French Revolution borders, but the Holy Roman Empire was never again seen in Europe. The finality of its destruction was absolute. Significance. Phenomenology remains Hegel's most influential work and his finest book. The sheer originality of its method, its conception of philosophy as a reflection of human history, and its famous arguments for the community rather than the individual as a basic subject of thought and action, have all accounted for its enduring importance. Phenomenology, whether it is viewed as an introduction to his later work or as a work of individual importance, certainly improved Hegel's standing in philosophical circles. It not only marked a significant departure from contemporary thought, it also raised the stakes in terms of scope and ambition. Phenomenology was so detailed and rich that it amounts to an examination of the possibility and viability of an actual historical form of life, a historical experience conducted under the assumption of such competencies and their interrelationship. It has inspired dozens of later scholars, as politically diverse as Karl Marx and Francis Fukuyama, and inspired a school of thought, Hegelianism. The ideas contained in phenomenology gave rise to historicism, a philosophy emphasizing the historical development of society that was to have a major impact on the political evolution of Europe and the world. End of Section 2, Module 8. Coming up next, Section 3, Impact. Module 9, The First Responses. Section 3, Impact. Module 9, The First Responses. Key points. Hegel was accused of having returned to the rationalism of the philosophers Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Christian Wolff. Phenomenology was also seen by some as incomprehensible due to its complexity. The arguments that Hegel overestimated the power of conceptual theorizing and that he tried to combine highly abstract thought with historical development have both endured. The complexity of the text seems to have baffled many contemporary thinkers, leading to criticisms based on misunderstandings. Criticism. A handful of reviews of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit appeared in the first few years following its publication. The reviewers were united, both in their verdict that Hegel's style was extremely dense and obscure, and in their general misunderstanding of the book. No critical agreement was reached. Many of the book's harsher critics were doubtless taking revenge for the scathing and frequently sarcastic reviews their books had received in the Critical Journal of Philosophy. They might not have been certain Hegel wrote the attacks, but they certainly suspected he was involved. One of the criticisms leveled was that Hegel had simply returned to the philosophical approach of rationalism of the thinkers Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Christian Wolff, which had dominated German philosophy for most of the 18th century. According to the rational approach, knowledge can only be achieved through reason. A review from 1809 in the Allgemeine Literaturzeitung, General Literary Times, for example, argued that Hegel had made a fundamental error pointed out by Kant, namely that we could gain definitive knowledge of objects just through using formal logic. Had Hegel, it asked, not understood a central point of the Kantian revolution, that our concepts have meaning only in relation to sensory experience? Other reviewers simply found it incomprehensible. A review from Neue Leipzig Literaturzeitung, New Leipzig Literary Times, for instance, failed to see how Hegel could show that the shapes of consciousness he surveyed were one-sided, suppressing aspects of their true selves theoretically opposed to their own essence. The reviewer, therefore, claimed that the book was littered with contradictions. He pointed to Hegel's claim that the truth of the master's consciousness is the slave's. Instead of seeing how this claim pointed to the need for master and slave to recognize one another as equals, the reviewer simply took it as a contradiction. Responses. The misunderstandings the critics displayed were so fundamental, they hardly deserved detailed responses. Two particularly crude criticisms of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit have enjoyed an enduring shelf life. The review from 1807 in the Oberdeutsche Allgemeine Literaturzeitung, South German general literary newspaper, mistook Hegel's philosophy for a version of that of the philosopher Fichte. Yet in doing so, the reviewer complained that Hegel overestimated the power of theorizing, and failed to acknowledge that certain things might be unknowable, and therefore one would be unable to categorize them systematically. Critics have since frequently leveled the charge that Hegel swallows up all reality in his theory of the absolute. The philosopher J.F. Fries disliked phenomenology because of its unpalatable language, adding that the whole thing was completely contradictory, since it declared all knowledge to be in flux and relative, while at the same time suggesting it spoke from an absolute standpoint. While the charge of relativism is crude and misplaced, Hegel's attempt to combine metaphysics with historical development has continually presented an obstacle to his readers. Conflict and consensus. Nevertheless, Hegel's developing conception of his own philosophy does not owe anything to contemporary critiques of phenomenology. After the Napoleonic invasion of Vienna, the city was largely in ruins, many fled, and the university could barely function. Hegel left the city and did not become a university professor until 1816. In 1807, he went to the town of Bamberg to edit a pro-Napoleonic newspaper, and in 1808, he became rector of a gymnasium, a type of secondary school, in Nuremberg. These demanding activities, following so soon after the publication of Phenomenology, are another reason why his philosophical development did not come from dialogue with his early critics. Much more formative was the experience of using Phenomenology as a text for his teaching at the gymnasium. Doing so forced him to reconsider the status of the text within his system, and its adequacy as an introduction to that system. The teaching guidelines set by his friend Friedrich Emanuel Niethammer, the Commissioner of Education in Bavaria, specified an introduction to knowledge of the universal coherence of the sciences. From this, Hegel understood that he was to teach how the different philosophical sciences were logically interrelated. With this in mind, he produced what he called an encyclopedia of his emerging system as a basis for teaching. Hegel eventually integrated the first sections of Phenomenology into this encyclopedia, which became the basis for his mature system. The phenomenological sections established the standpoint of universal consciousness, which was needed for a more detailed philosophy of spirit. This philosophy would then serve as the basis for the standpoint of his logic of basic ontological categories, and for his real philosophy, that is, his philosophy of nature and spirit. The fact that the historical sections of Phenomenology did not appear in their earlier form had, in fact, very little to do with criticisms the text had received. End of Section 3, Module 9. Coming up next, Section 3, Impact, Module 10, The Evolving Debate. Section 3, Impact, Module 10, The Evolving Debate. Key points. Of all Hegel's ideas, his linking of philosophical thought to the progression of history has had the most impact both in the abstract world of philosophy and in the real world of politics. The initial left and right Hegelians gave way to more complex schools of thought. Neo-Kantianism, Marxism, and positivism all owe some debt to Hegel, even if they oppose his thoughts. The most significant school is, however, the one directly related to Hegel, Hegelianism. Hegel's thoughts were, for a time, overshadowed by the theories of Karl Marx, which changed the political landscape of the world for almost an entire century. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, thinkers such as Francis Fukuyama reclaimed Hegel. Uses and problems. Due to the complexity of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, what passes for Hegelian is often simply what has been labeled Hegelian by his interpreters and critics. Tracing the influence of Phenomenology of Spirit on the evolution of philosophical debate requires careful sorting through the representations and misrepresentations of both its supporters and critics. Hegel's great legacy has been the idea that history is essential to philosophy, and phenomenology has remained the central text for those seeking to exploit this key Hegelian idea. Phenomenology is one of the main game changers, not just of modern philosophy, but of Western philosophy as a whole. For many in philosophy, and especially for thinkers in the humanities, Hegel's famous contention that philosophy is its own time captured in thought represents an intellectual point of no return. Intellectual theorizing can be understood only as it emerges from its background historical conditions, be they social, economic, or political. In terms of the text's evolution, one must be cautious. Hegel's methodology was both unfinished and open to interpretation. Philosophers such as Karl Marx and Alexander Kojève did not complete the work. They either adapted or reinterpreted it. Schools of thought. Considerable historical and interpretive care is needed when attempting to understand the philosophical camps that formed in the decades after Hegel's death in 1831. The right Hegelians, whose influence on subsequent philosophy has been small, took themselves to be bearers of Hegelian orthodoxy. Often politically conservative, their view that the mid-19th century Prussian state was the peak of European civilization was not to stand the test of history. The left, or young Hegelians, especially Ludwig Feuerbach and Karl Marx, however, have had an enormous intellectual impact. Marx's influential theory of economic change, which he called dialectical materialism, for example, adapts several elements of Hegel's theory of dialectical development. These philosophers would, however, set themselves up as severe critics of what they saw as Hegel's idealism and theoretical method. Current scholarship, though, clearly shows that their dismissals of Hegel rely on caricatures, and their own positive views remain deeply indebted to his work. Similarly, large-scale philosophical movements have been born as reactions to so-called Hegelian idealism. Both the positivist and neo-Kantian schools of philosophy and social science that emerged in the mid-19th century were reactions to the apparent threat of Hegelian idealism. Likewise, the empiricist nature of early 20th century analytic philosophy, with its emphasis on the necessity of verifiable evidence, comes from a reaction to another false representation of Hegelianism. In this case, it was the reaction of the philosophers G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell to the theoretical excesses of the British idealists active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In current scholarship, recent non-metaphysical readings of G.W.F. Hegel have inspired new thinking among key contemporary philosophers. In particular, University of Pittsburgh philosophers John McDowell and Robert Brandom and their followers are only half-jokingly known as the Pittsburgh Hegelians. For both, phenomenology of spirit has been their almost exclusive object of study. McDowell and Brandom are adapting select themes of phenomenology and modernizing them through current analytic techniques. In particular, they read Hegel through the ideas of the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, whose famous essay, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, was initially subtitled Méditation hegelienne. Contemporary political philosophy also shows a self-conscious Hegelian influence. This can be seen in critiques of such classics of 20th century liberal philosophy as John Rawls's A Theory of Justice. Thinkers associated with communitarian political philosophy, such as Michael Sandel and Michael Walzer, challenge some of Rawls's work. For example, the idea that the main task of a political philosophy is to justify methods for distributing goods or securing a private space in which individuals can pursue their own ends. While communitarianism, a social philosophy emphasizing the links between individual and community, is generally thought to have its philosophical roots in the Greek philosopher Aristotle and Hegel, its representatives do not necessarily work with Hegel's actual texts. Nevertheless, critics of liberalism, a political philosophy founded on the importance of individual liberty, such as Charles Taylor and Alasdair MacIntyre, who are sympathetic toward communitarianism to some degree, are deeply involved with Hegel's texts. MacIntyre, and especially Taylor, have made important contributions to our understanding of phenomenology. Both are influenced by Hegel's historicist notion of rationality and the logic of dialectal historical development the text proposes. MacIntyre and Taylor also emphasize the importance of rationality to communities and traditions. More recently, Robert Pippin, although no critic of political liberalism, has written strong critiques of certain dominant Rawlsian and Kantian trends in modern political and moral philosophy through his sophisticated interpretation of Hegel. End of Section 3, Module 10. Coming up next, Section 3, Impact. Module 11, Impact and Influence Today. Section 3, Impact. Module 11, Impact and Influence Today. Key points. Two broad camps exist, split roughly between the Anglo-Americans and the continental Europeans. The latter are less suspicious of Hegel's attempts to create ideas that are systematically complete. Although Hegel's work is of immense significance, it remains one of the most difficult texts to understand in all philosophy. Major arguments continue over its metaphysical and non-metaphysical meaning. Idealist philosophers claim that Hegel successfully continued Immanuel Kant's work, but those leaning toward Hegelian metaphysics claim that his work is a continuation of pre-Kantian ideas that stretch back to the philosophers Leibniz and even Aristotle. Position. The power of phenomenology to offer philosophical inspiration can be seen in its fate in Anglophone, English-speaking, analytic philosophy. It was abandoned by Anglophone philosophers after Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore rejected the Hegelianism of their British idealist teachers and created analytic philosophy. Since the early 1990s, however, some major figures in analytic philosophy have started to engage with phenomenology. Some of these, such as Robert Brandom, are in the American pragmatist tradition. Few could have anticipated such a philosophical marriage. Indeed, William James, a founder of pragmatism, claimed to have understood Hegel only while under the influence of laughing gas. Contemporary interest in phenomenology can also be seen in the output of some prominent philosophers working within the field of critical theory, a branch of philosophy rooted in the analysis of contemporary society. Several of the text's key concepts, especially alienation and recognition, are seen as useful tools for contemporary social criticism. The scholar Axel Honneth, for example, has combined these with insights from psychoanalysis and the contemporary philosophy of language. Interaction. Philosophers today, lacking faith in Hegelian demands for systematic completeness, or for thinking without presupposing, have distanced themselves from one of his central intentions. Anglo-American philosophy, in particular, is characterized by a suspicion of grand systematizing. Instead, it believes in a piecemeal approach to philosophy that deals with specific philosophical and technical problems. Only in continental Europe, perhaps thanks to the philosopher Martin Heidegger, has Hegel's systematization remained influential. Nevertheless, specific Hegelian ideas, if not their systematic ambition, continue to challenge the intellectual environment. In continental philosophy, Hegel became a key philosophical reference point, as Phenomenology became the key Hegelian text. This was driven by the fact that the importance for Karl Marx's philosophy was becoming clear. In the Anglo-American world, Phenomenology had to overcome two main challenges. First, Hegel's name was synonymous with the philosophical systematizing of the past. Second, there were political reasons for avoiding Hegel. During World War II and the Cold War, Hegel was associated respectively with German nationalism and with the Marxism and communism that his work inadvertently inspired. Classic statements of political suspicion toward Hegel are found in the political theorist Isaiah Berlin's 1958 lecture, Two Concepts of Liberty, and the Austrian-British philosopher Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies of 1945. Regarding the first challenge, the grounds for an appreciation of Hegel's ideas were laid by a gradual resurgence in Kantian idealism, which, as we have seen, is a philosophy founded on the notion that reality is constructed in the mind. The work of philosophers such as Peter Strawson was crucial here. Strawson used the Kantian idea of fundamental conceptual schemes underlying our interpretation of the world as a way to correct the prevailing empiricism. Such work paved the way for the exploration of post-Kantian idealism, especially Hegel's, that we see today, and that builds on the idea of a conceptual scheme. Regarding the second challenge, philosophers such as Charles Taylor and Shlomo Avineri wrote important works on Hegel in the 1970s that did much to explain the true nature of his political work. Taylor emphasized that far from being proto-totalitarian, Hegel's political vision was intended to preserve the rights and liberties of Enlightenment thought. It also tried to explain how individuals could view the state as more than just a means of safeguarding a private sphere. The continuing debate. A debate has arisen within the scholarly community since the early 1990s among those studying Hegel and German idealism. It is usually characterized as taking place between supporters of metaphysical and supporters of non-metaphysical interpretations of Hegel, although many of the participants would reject these labels. The non-metaphysical reading challenges the received view that Hegel is a traditional metaphysician who returns to pre-Kantian rationalism, that is, to philosophy as was practiced in Europe prior to Kant's critique of metaphysics. For supporters of the metaphysical view, Hegel belongs to a philosophical tradition for which being and reality are open to analysis by the rational intellect, a tradition whose roots go back through Leibniz all the way to Aristotle. Non-metaphysical views, such as that put forward in the American philosopher Robert Pippin's Hegel's Idealism, The Satisfactions of Self-Consciousness, 1991, take seriously Hegel's claim to have completed Kant's philosophical revolution. Hegel's absolute idealism, so these interpreters claim, continues the workings of Kant. In other words, Hegel's philosophy is not an uncritical inquiry into the nature of being. Rather, it is an exploration of the extent to which our finite minds can comprehend the universe and our experience of it. While this issue is really just a skirmish within the narrow world of Hegel studies, it has made clear the stakes involved in the heated question of contemporary philosophy's relation to its history. Critics, for example Friedrich Beiser, of the recent attempt to portray Hegel as initiating a Kantian-influenced investigation into the grounds of what we know, attack interpreters such as Robert Pippin and Terry Pinkard for not being faithful to Hegel's intentions and for ignoring his wider work. Writers such as Beiser are motivated in part by a worry that if we read past philosophers too much in our own image and in the light of current concerns, we lose sight of the original challenges they faced and the insights they can give us. In addition, there has been a general tendency of philosophy from the English-speaking world to fall into two camps, which the American philosopher Richard Rorty labeled rational and historical reconstruction. Both camps tend to exercise a kind of historical neutrality, as if the work, as the British thinker Gilbert Ryle noted, had been published in last week's philosophical journals. End of Section 3, Module 11. Coming up next, Section 3, Impact, Module 12, Where Next? Section 3, Impact, Module 12, Where Next? Key points. Since the collapse of communism in 1991, the theories of Karl Marx have fallen from grace. This has created a renewed interest in Hegel that cuts across traditional political factions. Hegel's masterpiece will continue to inspire, not least because its inaccessibility gives great scope for interpretation. Hegel began debates that continue today. The sheer breadth of his ideas influenced political philosophy for centuries. His influence on Marx has seen the world's political landscape shift in numerous radical ways. Potential. Much of G.W.F. Hegel's mature thought, particularly that was published after Phenomenology of Spirit, receives relatively little attention. This is partly due to changes in the philosophical climate. Hegel's Science of Logic, 1812 to 1816, which lays out the conceptual structure of the absolute, seems to exist in a parallel philosophical universe to contemporary philosophy, which prefers a piecemeal approach and uses a logic developed in the early 20th century. But philosophical fashion is fickle, and Hegel's speculative logic might well have an unexpected future. When it comes to the political philosophy of the philosophy of right, however, much of its content simply belongs to a bygone age. The political realities of early 19th century Prussia are long gone. Few today believe that phenomenology can possess the significance Hegel intended, since it was supposed to be a justification for, and was governed by, his logic. Likewise, contemporary social and political realities mean that key concepts of phenomenology can have, at best, limited application. Yet in spite of historical change and philosophical fashion, phenomenology has had a remarkable ability to retain its relevance. Of course, much of its popularity in the 20th century has been due to its connection with Marxism. Yet the decline of Marxism has not been mirrored by a decline in interest in phenomenology. Quite the opposite. Philosophers are now looking back at the text with fresh eyes, and not as a means simply to support the ideas of a different philosophical theory. Future directions. Phenomenology looks set to continue to be a source of insights for philosophers of all kinds. Those, for example, who believe that knowledge does not come exclusively through the senses, but instead requires forms of conceptual mediation, are always going to be drawn to Hegel's arguments. Phenomenology is also likely to remain the seminal text for those philosophers who see an essential connection between theory and practice, philosophical developments, and the historical time in which they emerged. Finally, however different our societies are from Hegel's own, many philosophers still say that it is Hegel who best understands the conflicts of value that underlie the modern world. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, in his classic book Hegel, 1975, and later in his Sources of the Self, 1989, argues that we are caught between two sources of value: rational autonomy, the idea that each individual can direct his or her own life through his or her own reason, and what Taylor called expressive unity, the need to see oneself expressed in wider wholes, for example, works of art, religious practices, or the community. Suggesting one is more important than the other, as so much contemporary moral and political philosophy does, cannot do justice to the different goods essential to modern identity. Hegel, Taylor argues, has given us the most sophisticated account of this conflict and its historical sources. If we do not agree with Hegel's solutions, we must first clarify the reasons for that disagreement and then face the problems he diagnosed ourselves. Summary. Phenomenology is, in many respects, a product of its age. Although produced at a time of radical revolutions in Europe, it was nevertheless written within the context of the Holy Roman Empire, a political institution founded in the Middle Ages. Hegel shared the opinion of his contemporaries that philosophy must form a system derivable from a single principle, a belief that can seem odd to contemporary minds. Yet of all the philosophical works of the period, indeed of the 19th century as a whole, phenomenology has enjoyed the most interest and influence. Today, its ideas provide inspiration for projects not only in fields familiar to Hegel, such as the theory of knowledge, but also in areas to which he paid little attention, or that simply did not exist in his time, such as the philosophy of language. Similarly, many of the book's key concepts, such as alienation or recognition, continue to be developed within political thought and social criticism. These fields are currently re-examining the contributions of phenomenology as it emerges from the Marxist context in which it has sat for most of the 20th century. The sheer variety of topics in phenomenology and its attempt to integrate them within one philosophical vision makes it a work without comparison. Hegel's attempt to write a developmental history of Western consciousness that includes and connects its central philosophical and cultural moments has never been equaled. Its novel method of immanent critique, on the other hand, in which a position is criticized by its own internal standards and assumptions, continues to breed imitators in a variety of fields. Perhaps most important of all, phenomenology is often viewed as the text in which Hegel does most to pursue the idea that sets his thought apart from previous philosophy, namely, that philosophical truth is essentially developmental and is therefore one and the same as its emergence in historical time. For contemporary Hegelians, this is a lesson that today's philosophy would do well to learn, even if the prospects of somebody writing a Phenomenology of Spirit Part 2, extending Hegel's text from the early 19th century to the early 21st century, look dim indeed. End of Section 3, Module 12, of a Macat analysis of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. The first major work of Western philosophy to introduce the idea that the truths of philosophy are inseparable not only from the history of philosophy itself, but also from the histories and politics of the societies in which they arise, phenomenology continues to inspire prominent thinkers in its field. Yet its impact transcends the narrow field of professional philosophy. Its developmental account of self-consciousness and social relations, along with its themes of mutual recognition and the struggle between master and slave, have influenced academic disciplines ranging from psychoanalysis to sociology. Through its direct impact on Karl Marx and his intellectual successors, it has also become a key text for political movements throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. You can find out more about how Hegel's ideas have been challenged and applied and how his work has impacted on thinkers in other academic disciplines by exploring further in the Macat library. Macat's analyses cover 14 different subjects in the humanities and social sciences. To browse our whole multimedia library and get a lot more, visit www.macat.com today. Macat. Learn better. Think smarter. Aim higher.